Hello YouTube and welcome to the last weeks of patch 8.0 where we consider if we should stick to our class and spec for 8.1. I'm hoping that in today's video I can make that decision easier for you when it comes to Destro Warlock and maybe Warlocks in general. I know I've been trashing Blizzard a bit about the state of 8.0, but judging from the weekly hotfixes, constant patches and current changes to classes, it's hard to argue that they didn't get a lot of things right. I'm the kind of guy that doesn't mind mistakes. It's human to mess up, but what you do after those mistakes is what defines you. And I like what I'm seeing. Don't get me wrong, the current changes and iterations of patch 8.1 might still not be enough and there might be issues. But a lot of our concerns are being addressed one after the other, and if the trend continues, we might actually have a really cool expansion to play in the next few patches. Now, in the spirit of appeasing you, the viewers, I will be going over Destro and if you should play it in 8.1. Initially, I didn't plan for these videos to be super detailed, talking about buffs and nerfs, since although some of them are quite decent, numbers have a tendency to change, and I'm of a mind that things the general gameplay, feel and performance should be criteria for picking a class and a spec. Granted, performance is hard to gauge without actually playing the patch, which is why I didn't want to go into it too much. But since I have seen a lot of comments asking for more details, I will also address general Warlock changes for other specs as well that I haven't covered in their respective videos. So let's first kick it off with Destro. If you want a more detailed guide on destruction, I already covered that in a previous video, which you are welcome to check out once you are done with this one. But I will quickly go over some of the basic stuff that makes Destro what it is. Essentially, destruction is a pure spellcasting spec. Almost no demons, barely any dots, just cast and cast and cast. We generate soul shards with our basic spells such as Immolate and Incinerate, but at a reduced pace compared to Demonology. Still faster than Affliction though. And we spend those shards on Chaos Bolts for single target or Rain of Fire for large pack of mobs. On top of this, we have a very specific niche we are good at, and that is Cleave, which can be spread, granted the targets are not too far apart. This comes into play with our spell Havoc. Havoc mimics our single target spells, meaning that we can put Havoc on a target and hit another target with Chaos Bolt. The Havoc target will be hit as well, but by a reduced amount. This of course works with shard generation as well, though primarily you want to use Havoc with as many Chaos Bolts as humanly possible. Aside from this, the general gameplay is simpler and more straightforward than the other two specs. That doesn't necessarily mean it's worse. I personally enjoy a simpler version of my class every now and again, and simple is one way to put it. Considering the amount of mechanics that force you to move, you can argue there's a certain skill involved in planning your cast to align with your movement and make the most of your rotation. This always will separate the average Destros from the great ones, as with everything else of course. In terms of raid progression, Destro is doing better than Demo, being a little bit above average if we count both Mythic and Heroic. For Mythic Plus, the AoE damage is not as good as Demonology, and single target not as good as Affliction, although in terms of burst, Destro outshines them both. When it comes to strengths, Destruction Warlocks don't actually suffer from its counterparts' weaknesses. There is barely any ramp up time. The only ramp up you will do is generate a few shards for Chaos Bolts, which is a lot easier than it sounds. One other thing, the cooldowns that we have are amazing. Both Infernal and Dark Soul, if you spec into it, give us insane burst on bosses and priority targets. Arguably, Destro has one of the biggest bursts in the game. Another point to make is the cleave mechanic we get with Havoc. Couple this with our cooldowns and we excel on fights like Vectis, Fetid, Zul, fights where there are important adds to burst down, or fights like Shrine of the Storm with a double boss encounter. But with upsides come downsides, and the downside to our amazing burst damage during our cooldowns comes outside of them, making us do as much damage as Rihanna did in that one fight. What? Not proper? Oh, she's too hot to care, what are you on about? But back to more serious matters. Outside of our cooldowns, we really feel underwhelming, and this is a point addressed by the community of Warlocks for the longest time. In 8.1 we are receiving a few changes. We actually are getting a new passive, Demonic Embrace, that increases our stamina by 10%. Reminds me of the old days when Warlock was known to be the caster with the most HP, which at the time made sense since we had life tap. With the new passive we also have some changes to the PvP talents. Curse of Weakness has been changed to reduce the target's attack power by 30% instead of reducing their physical damage dealt by 25%. This change was applied to all specs as well. On top of this, Destro and Affliction got Demon Armor as a new talent. It gives another 10% max health boost and an increase in armor by 125%. I haven't PvP'd that much, but the arenas I did, I really felt Warlocks were missing something in the defensive department. And looking at their representation at BlizzCon and in esports in general, I feel like this change should have come a little bit sooner. But better late than never. Another PvP talent that was buffed is Casting Circle, that previously had a 1.5 cast time and it's now down to 0.5 seconds. For destruction so far, I haven't seen any changes to the talent system, which is a bit of a shame, because we suffer from the uninterested talent tree as many others do. But that might come in the future. In the meantime, we have to be content with the new Azerite trait, Chaos Shard, that will be replacing Accelerant on the current Azerite pieces. Incendiary damage is increased, and once we will get up a full Soul Shard all the way, we get a 5% chance to generate an additional Soul Shard over 2 seconds. I do think this is a better trait, however outside of simming we need to test it and see the overall change in gameplay. Each spec has received a trait that replaced an existing one, with Demonology having Baleful Invocation instead of Forbidden Knowledge, and Affliction having Pandemic Invocation instead of Death Bloom. All of these traits are addressing Soul Shards. I like the traits, but how competitive they will be, I won't know until I will compulsively sim myself. Forbidden Knowledge hasn't been taken out of the game entirely, but it has been buffed though. I was on the fence with this trait for the longest time. On one hand, it's there to force you to cast a full Demon Bolt, which this expansion is making it pretty hard to do with all the movement required. On the other hand, it changes your gameplay, where now you have to cast this insane spell. Prior to this change, it was simply a DPS loss to do it, but after the buff it might change, and if Blizzard will give me a good enough reason to risk being hit by the fire just to cast a Pyroblast-like spell, then I'm all in for it. We also have a few buffs to Affliction traits, Dreadful Calling and Inevitable Demise. Dreadful Calling is the kind of trait that I enjoy seeing. It's the same mechanic as Anger Management, and I like optimizing my rotation to reach a certain goal. It was always underperforming, so I couldn't use it as much. Now with a 30% buff to its damage, things might change. Inevitable Demise was a quirky trait that I ran for lack of a better option. It was really cool to see those huge drain life ticks. The ramp up was way too long to be fun though, which has been reduced to 50 stacks from 100. But the biggest change is that Agony will now proc it. Before, it was easy to put a Seed of Corruption with the Absolute Corruption as well and get all the stacks you needed. Now it seems you need to work harder to get those stacks, but the damage was buffed on the other hand. Terror of the Mind is another trait which seems a universal one for Warlocks. It's interesting, but I could only see it work in PvP. You don't really see fears in dungeons or raids. Should you play Destro in 8.1? Well, as I see it at the moment, the traits have been revealed and they don't really seem appealing. And the core issue with Destro still hasn't been addressed, which is a turnoff for me. That core being low damage outside of our cooldowns. But if you like big numbers during your cooldowns and just have fun with the simpler spec, then go for it. I for one will be looking at Demo and Affliction a bit more than Destruction in 8.1. But what do you guys think? Do you find the current iteration of Destro fun enough to do progress rating or Mythic Plus pushes? Let me know what you think, and hit that subscribe button if you want to stay up to date with more 8.1 coverage coming to you from Marcelian&Flame. Thank you very much for sticking around and watching the video guys, and I wish you have a really wonderful week. Peace!